Well, I think we'll just kick it off here, and thanks everyone for joining us. Just a few bits of housekeeping while other people join. Everyone will be on mute throughout. However, if you do have any questions, feel free to use the chat function, which we will keep an eye on. The session will be recorded and will be shared with you later on. So, as everyone knows, I hope, we do a series called IP360, which is this webinar series, and we will be just focusing today on the domains segment. And I apologise now, but we're trialling new technology, and I'm thrilled to be in the office with Nick and Lorna today. But we've had new technology installed over the weekend. We are the guinea pigs using it, so this could go all disastrously wrong, but hopefully we'll be all right. So just give a brief overview. IP360 is more than an ethos, it's a footprint really to the all-encompassing service that Lewis Silkin offers. And I'm extremely proud that Lewis Silkin are working with Com Laude to offer domain management, which complements the wraparound, as you can see on your screen, the strategy management, protection and enforcement services that we at Lewis Silkin have an outstanding reputation for. So it's an honour to be joined by Nick and Lorna from Com Laude today. It's fair to say that we're joined by two of the most respected and known figures in the domain world globally, and it's always a pleasure to see them and be in their company, and certainly to hear them speak. And if any of our audience have been fortunate to hear Nick and Lorna speak before, you'll be familiar with the passion and enthusiasm they both have for all things domains, and explains the straightforward choice of a partner for us. We'll hear from Nick about the latest Icann developments and how these will impact brand owners in the not so distant future. And Lorna will give us an overview of what we should all be doing to best manage our domain portfolios. Prior to Com Laude, Nick and Lorna co-founded NetSearchers, a company described as possibly the best domain name management company in the world, and certainly the first to treat domains as IP, not IT. So I'm sure after today we'll be leaving the webinar safe in the knowledge that Com Laude continue to lead the way for others to follow. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Lorna.
Thank you very much. So, this slide, which I hope you can read, and if you can't, you can find it on our website. This sets out our 10 principles of domain management. At Com Laude, when a new client comes to us, we always go through the pain points that they've been experiencing and look at how they can be mitigated now that they've come to us. Over the years, we've distilled this into these 10 key fundamental truths about domain portfolio management. They really apply to a tiny portfolio, they apply to an enormous portfolio, just at different scales. Almost invariably, we find that problems that have arisen in domain portfolios have come about because one or more of these principles aren't being followed. Now, each of these could be a presentation in itself, but you'll be delighted to know that I'm just going to pull out a few points. First, number one is understanding. First up, know what you've got. Get your arms around your portfolio. Do an audit of every domain you own, how it's managed, where it points, who the internal owner is, so you can find out if it's still useful or not. Look at the bigger picture. Where's your portfolio heading? Has it grown appropriately to support your business, or is it full of redundant names? The first thing we do on taking over a portfolio is audit what a client's got. It's the fundamental bedrock on which everything else that I'm going to say is based. Number two is security. Now, this is a really obvious one. It's key to know your risks and decide on the appropriate mitigations. This is such a large subject, it definitely deserves its own presentation. We'd love to come back and do one on those, but for now, just know that this is fundamental. 3 and 4 are closely linked. Right sizing is making sure that your portfolio supports your business goals. Now, ideally, that means you've got all the domains you need and none of the domains you don't need. That's the ideal. Most people are sort of somewhere in between the two, but our ideal is to reach that point where you have exactly what you need and not one more. Now, benchmarking helps to define a scope of what that should look like. So, does your domain portfolio follow your trademark portfolio, or are they completely out of kilter with one another? What are your industry peers doing? Are you really an outlier, or are you looking fairly similar to them? Now, there can be very good reasons for being out of kilter or being an outlier, but that can help to clarify your thinking if you know that you are. You can challenge yourself when you know where you stand. Cost, that's number 5, that feels a very obvious point, but what tends to be overlooked when we look in an annual budgeting cycle is the whole life cost of a domain. So, for example, if you've got a trademark, you will find that in .suck, it will cost you $25,000 at least to own it for just 10 years. Now, bearing in mind that that registry is entirely supported on the back of corporate registering defensively, it has almost no wider traction. Is $25,000 a good investment? We would absolutely say it's not. Ignore that TLD. Linked to cost, of course, is number 6, return on investment. I paraphrase that as give every domain a job. That doesn't have to mean that it's got to be pointed somewhere. Its job can be to be entirely defensive and protect your reputation. But where possible, we do suggest capturing any potential traffic that's there. Number 7, having a domain champion. We've got a slide coming up later that shows how many touch points there can be for a domain life cycle in a typical organization. It's not necessarily bad to have a lot of different touch points, but what we've seen is that if none of those touch points, the people who touch the domain, are empowered to set domain strategy and policy detail, in other words, to be responsible for good domain governance, then portfolios will have a tendency to grow unchecked, risks won't get recognised, they will persist and nobody will be dealing with them, and also your digital presence can become confused because you have a plethora of different URLs, different ways of using your name, different configuration of domain names. Being the domain champion isn't necessarily a comfortable role because, particularly at first, you're going to be saying no a lot. But we've worked with clients to implement this role in a really positive way for a number of different organisations. Training, that's often a bit of an afterthought, but if a client has a knowledgeable individual working on domains, then that person can advise their colleagues and really help with smooth processing. They can assist the champion with his or her good domain governance program. Compliance, of course, is all about accurate records. It's an essential risk mitigation. And finally, when a company is choosing its registrar, well, of course, we'd recommend choosing a corporate domain registrar, but it really does make good sense to do that. Retail registrars can be really good at what they do, but they will always prioritise what works for the majority of their customers over the more specialised needs of a corporate. So, for example, they typically will have a liability cap of 10 times the value of a domain name, and that will work to keep costs down for all of their retail customers. That's great, but that is far too low for a .com on which $1 billion company relies. So that's a real gallop through 10 precepts that we use and we examine and we measure portfolios against. I'm going to pass over to Nick now, and I'll join you later.
Thanks, Lorna. Lorna spoke about principles. I want to speak about beliefs. So I think there's 5 core beliefs that underpin these principles. You can see them up there. They look pretty simple. I'm going to go through them in a little bit of depth. I've developed these beliefs over 25 years of working in the domain industry with many lovely clients and 1 or 2 tricky clients as well, of course. Let's begin, if we can jump forward one, Alex, by thinking about domain name signpost authenticity. So you might see domain names as the kind of red-headed stepchildren to your lovely trademarks, but your customers see your domain names as signposts to content of which genuine goods and services can be found. And we all know the basics which have been honed over 25 years of e-commerce, or 20 years of e-commerce. So there's not much point in going into those, accurate records, effective renewals, and so on. But I want to talk to you about domain toolkits. So domain toolkits are, in our view, are the replacement of policies. It used to be that clients of ours would ask us, could we help them to develop a domain name policy? And policies were great, written out, published sometimes, but in our experience, really not very often used by requesters. So a requester is a colleague of yours who's got the right to request a domain name. And if you create a toolkit as opposed to a policy, then we find you are nudging them towards making a request for a domain name, which is much easier to fulfill and manage. So a domain toolkit should include perhaps details about who can request a domain name, when and why, and also it can suggest alternatives to who can request a domain name. So if there's a critical incident, you don't just need to say this person has requested the domain name and we've got their details in our records, but also who the alternative is, so you can go to them if there's a problem. The toolkit should set out what can be registered. It's very important, and also alternatives to domain names. For example, subdomains or folders, which of course don't cost any money, a lot cheaper. So just nudging someone at the point they're about to request a domain name to a subdomain or even to a folder can be very useful in keeping costs down. The toolkit should talk about who pays for a domain name, and this is particularly important if it's a premium domain name. Now, with the range of clients that we've got, we see all kinds of models. So we see some clients who've got a very centralized model, where the center pays for all domain names. We also see decentralized models, where brand managers or business managers in a particular country, where they will pay for a domain name. The point is, the payment for a domain name needs to cover not just the first year, but it needs to cover subsequent years as well. And it does also need to cover premium pricing, as I mentioned earlier. There are a few other points that the toolkit can talk about in a friendly way. It can talk about setting the priority of the domain, how to do that. Because if that is recorded in the system, in the in-house management system, then it does really help to keep kind of costs down. Toolkit can tell you what to do if a domain is requested by a third party. It can talk to you about whether the domain name needs proxy ownership. And very importantly, the toolkit should suggest how you use the domain name. Lorna spoke about this earlier, about domain names kind of paying their own way. The toolkit can nudge people in the right direction, whereas the policy used to kind of preach to them a little bit. So that's really about domain name signposting authenticity. We can jump on, please, Alex. So the next one, domain names having the characteristics of IP and the functionality of IT. And Alex kindly mentioned that earlier. Responsibility for domain names today is commonly shared by a number of professionals. And sometimes that brings challenges, because who is it who drives strategy? Is it the IP attorney who treats a domain name as more as IP than as IT? Or is it the IT specialist who wants it kept secure? Or is it the digital marketing person who really just wants to use the domain name? Can be tensions. You don't really want those tensions. So we think it's really important for domain name management to be coordinated. Don't just come together every 3 years when you're considering putting out your domain name management to tender. We suggest you might come together once a quarter, even if it's just for a 1-hour meeting. Kind of come together and discuss trends and issues, and in particular, do discuss metrics. And so, what are the metrics that you might gather? I've got a list of them here. You're going to be startled today by the number of lists that Laura and I have got, but I do just want to run through some of the things that you can gather. Obvious start total number of domains that you manage month by month, broken down into generic top-level domains and country code domains, and also IDNs, internationalized domains in other scripts. The number of new registrations monthly by priority tier, the number of deletions and lapses, the number of critical incidents. Now, if you're meeting with your colleagues in IT and in digital marketing or information services, critical incidents is an important thing to focus on. The traffic across domains. Registrars should be able to provide you with a lot of good information on that, or your own IS people should be. The cost of new registrations by quarter, but not just the general cost, but costs broken down into the cost of the registrar, the cost of the registry, and the cost of any third party, because that enables you to compare apples with apples. The cost of renewals, of course, by quarter, spend on acquiring domain names from the third market, and then also the number of internal requests that you receive and the number fulfilled quarterly. We see some domain name departments who are run ragged because the volume of domain names they're responsible for is going up and up and up, and yet their resource base is not increasing at all. And then also, if you're gathering metrics, you might want to look at monthly domain name monitoring reports to identify third-party registration trends and any attacks on them. So quite a lot around on that slide. Another big list. I'm going to try and move away from lists in a minute. If we could go to the next one, please, Alex. So the third point, I feel very passionately that domain names are generally undervalued. Without domain names, none of us would have an effective web presence. None of us would have email. Most social media wouldn't work. But you know, a .com domain name costs about just under $10. The .com registry, a .uk domain costs just under £4 at Nominet. So the cost of a domain name and its value are really not quite in step. So when you think about the basics, then I think it's very important to know about the full life cost of a domain. So across a 10-year period, what's that domain going to cost you? And if you do have low priority domains, domains which we'd really rather get rid of, but you're a little bit uncomfortable about having them, then there may be a solution for you. So we run something that we call cold storage. So for clients who've got unloved domain names, they don't much want them, but they're worried about just pushing them out there again, then we maintain them for an extremely low price as long as they've got no functionality. No point to websites, don't carry any content or anything like that. I think you also need to be thinking about, I said earlier, to the alternatives to domains, because domains do cost money. And sometimes people, requesters may say, I'd like to have a domain name. But what they really mean is, I'd like to have a web page on the main site, and is there some kind of address which I can use to point people towards it? So domain is not always the answer to the question that your requesters ask you about. We think that you should monitor malicious activity around your most important brands, because you don't want your customers misled. So if a domain has got any value, then monitor it. There are many types of domain name watching. You need to get the full record. You need to see if there's a website that's live kind of content hanging off it. Doesn't matter what type you use, but just use a type that you're happy with, but do monitor. Don't ignore confusingly similar or identical domains that can be used to kind of surround your key domains and to sidetrack your customers. And then also understand your domain name life cycle. And Lorna mentioned this earlier, and we've used this term of who is touching your domain name. Your domains are not just touched by you and by your team, they are touched by other people as well. So Lorna, perhaps you could talk about this.
I'm afraid this is another slide that you're probably going to find rather hard to read. It's a flowchart, and it's drawn from several different clients' experiences, which show how many touch points there can be in the way that an organisation processes domain orders. And the detail of it is less important than the overall appearance of it, so you see that there is a lot of back and forth. Now what we've done here is we've mapped out the as-is process with a view to streamlining it. You see that it shuttles back and forth between the digital team and the requester, maybe calling in the help of legal. And a lot of that back and forth is dealing with noise. As Nick says, people are asking for things that actually aren't domain names. They really wanted a URL, or they're asking for a domain name that doesn't fit your naming policy, or a domain name that you already own. So in this particular instance, or one instance I'm thinking of, we work with the client to look at their portal and to make it easier and quicker and more responsive to the requester for those requests to be funneled through the portal, because then you could put a lot of automatic filtering in so that it cut down on the amount of back and forth that you have to do.
Yeah. Thank you, Lauren. Yeah, so domain lifecycle, map your domain lifecycle or get your registrar to do it for you. You need to know who can come in and who can touch your domain name. So I'm going to move on much more to the future, and I've got a fairly challenging belief, which is that internet governance is important to all of this. And I wouldn't have said that a decade ago, but I think it is really important now. Icann, which many of you know as the California-based not-for-profit which governs the domain name system, is, I believe, the least worst option for controlling the internet's names and numbers. It is the vital champion of a free internet. And by a free internet, I mean the internet as we know it today, where you are not charged for publishing information that your customers, your shareholders, your friends, your family can look at. But this free model of the internet is under threat. Icann maintains interoperability. It balances government interests with private sector interests, with civil society interests. It's very good at bottom-up consensus-based policy building. Takes forever, but what it means is that no one can dominate any other group. It also encourages competition by the introduction of the new GTLDs. Now, you might think that was a waste of time, but before there was an Icann, the price of a .com was about $70. After Icann was created and it introduced multiple competing registrars, the price dropped to below $10. So lots of things which aren't perfect about Icann, but it's the least worst option because it has been keeping the internet stable and running since 1999, and it is at threat. And who's it at threat from? Well, it's largely at threat from one or two governments. In Switzerland, there's an organisation called the International Telecommunications Union, and currently there's a power struggle between two people who want to be the next chair of the ITU. One is an American who believes in the free internet and Icann and the way of operating that we know today. The other is a Russian, and the Russian does not believe in a free internet. The Russian believes that countries should have sovereignty over the way that the internet works. The Russian supports a proposal from China for the new IP. Now, IP in that sense doesn't mean intellectual property, it means internet protocol. The Russians are building out a new internet architecture which is based upon national sovereignty and national boundaries. So they see the boundaries of the internet going from, if you like, the ground up into space, through cyberspace. And they believe that you should register for it, and they believe that you should pay for it. And they're aiming to have this new model, which will replace the root server system that we have at the moment. They aim to have it ready for 2030. If the Russian gets into the chair of the ITU, it will be a step closer. Now, many of you from big corporations, you have corporate governance people, you have people who work in government affairs or public policy. If you do, please tell them about this. It's widely written about, they can find it, but it is something that you should be paying attention to. So, point there about the about countries. I'm going to go on a bit and talk about CCTLDs captured by political factions or being insecure. Now, who would have thought a couple of years ago that something like the UK's registry, Nominet, could be captured? But as some of you will know, there was, to use a term, the Corbynisation of the Nominet membership for the UK last year. Earlier this year, it got extremely heated, and the chief executive and the board were turned by an outside faction. Now, a new chair has been parachuted in, courtesy of our government. That's not much spoken about, but I can't see how he got there if it wasn't our government putting him in there, and he intends to try and tamper things down. But CCTLDs are not nearly as secure as you might think they are. Another issue with internet governance is the consolidation of power within the Icann ecosystem. It used to be that in the, if you like, there was something called the GAC, the Government Advisory Committee of Icann. All these governments would sit together and they dot themselves about the room. But in going to 20 years of Icann meetings, you now get there and you kind of know that the Chinese are going to be sitting next to the Libyans, who are going to be sitting next to the Russians and so on. You can see the blocks sitting there, and over here you get the Australians and the New Zealanders and the Brits. And the Americans, they move around a little bit, but these power blocks emerge. So you see it in the government advisory system, and you also see it with companies like VeriSign. So this American corporation that does a very good job of running .com, which is the most prestigious, the most relied upon domain name. There's about 150 million of them in the world now, so running that registry is pretty important. But VeriSign has won the right to, or is in the process of winning the right, if it wins a legal challenge, to operate .web. So another three-letter, three-character domain name will arrive with us probably next year. What are they going to do? Are they going to grandfather everyone who's got a .com? Are they going to come to all of us and say, get your .web to match your .com? Or are they going to sell the .web to someone else? They're very powerful, so it's going to be interesting to see how they work. Now, they've got a lot of power in the Icann ecosystem. In Icann, you also get issues arriving which have got nowhere else to go. So there's a discussion at the moment about abusive domain names within Icann. It doesn't actually mean a domain name which is infringing intellectual property. It can do, but it's much more to do with malware and phishing. These are bad things and they need to be addressed somewhere. But actually, Icann is really a very good place to address that, because Icann really should be about the alphanumeric string that is a domain name. So there's an issue which should go somewhere, but has got nowhere else to go. Then the final point, which is probably much more relevant to all of you, is the fact that there is a review of the UDRP, which should have started 3 years ago in Icann. It's been rumbling along. It probably will start towards the beginning of next year. Now, the UDRP is the only proven low-cost, multi-jurisdictional tool that we have for combating cyber squatting in the GTLD space. It's proven. Over 100,000 domain names have been challenged through the UDRP since 1999. On the one hand, you have IP owners who would like some changes. A wish list might include user pays, might include a faster, expedited system for challenge it, for when there's a no-show. An IP owner might like an appeals mechanism. Against the IP owners are some, I'll call them domain investors or speculators. And some of them have said that they would prefer a system where, for example, every case has to be decided by 3 panelists, because that would be fairer, or where a panelist must never be allowed to file a UDRP complaint. So these are kind of complicated issues. WIPO is in favour of almost no changes, because they think tinkering around with what they see as kind of 20 years of jurisprudence isn't a very good idea. But the review is coming. You can feed into it. It is really, I say this, I've been saying this for 20 years. A brand owner who you only have to send one email to one of the comment periods, and people sit up and pay attention. I can really pay attention, because brands don't normally comment about this stuff. But please, when the time comes, do comment about the UDRP review. And so that takes me on to my 5th belief. And my 5th belief is kind of mistitled. It's about round 2 of the new GTLDs, and it says that it can offer benefits, but it can also offer challenges. I did wonder about saying that I believe that round 2 is, on the balance of probability, a good thing, but I turned it down a little bit, because I know that there's some of you on this call who are probably fundamentally against round 2, because round 1 was a classic example of disruptive innovation. It was meant to be introduced as kind of permissive innovation in a kind of calm, considered way, but actually the way it was implemented was very disruptive. And I know that, I can't see all the attendees, but I know that at least one of the people who signed up for this had a new GTLD and returned it. So they obviously thought the application of $185,000 and then about 50 grand a year, that it wasn't worth it. And I'm going to talk for 5 minutes about why it may be worth it and some of the points that you need to take into consideration. So can we jump forward? On the next slide, I've got a diagram showing some of the benefits for brand owners of applying. So we managed 120 applications in the first round. It's about 20% of the total submitted by brand owners. And the reasons why they applied are encapsulated there. And the reasons why just over 100 brand owners returned their GTLDs to Icann while they folded, actually it wasn't to do with not fulfilling these. It was normally to do with the fact that the application was championed by a legal team or by an IP owner. It was to do with the fact that Icann muddled the application process in the first round. Instead of taking about a year, it dragged out to 4 years. We had a client who, when she first started working with us as a single woman, by the time her application went live, she was married with a child. And so it took a long time. And what happened was that the legal teams who championed applications did not manage, or did not bring in at an early enough point, and probably this is our fault because we can push for it hard enough, but they didn't bring in the digital marketing teams, they didn't bring in some of the other, some of their colleagues who perhaps could have found ways of achieving these benefits. So if you jump onto the next slide, you'll see here some of the transparent .brand use cases which applicants have achieved. So there's 9 of them, driving business, the most obvious one, very popular at the bottom, using the new GTLD for kind of HR sites to support careers and so on. So you click on any of those and you can see examples of these kind of new GTLDs of brands in action, very transparent, above the line if you like. But most of these reasons, or most of these use cases, you could also do with a .com. You wouldn't have had quite the same level of control as you would do with a .brand, but you could also do with a .com, and that's why with the next slide, I think this is very important. There's a hidden value to .brand registries that we've been working on with our clients. And we've developed what we term a lift and shift strategy. So in the age of e-commerce, in this kind of global world that we're in, where 24/7 communication is vital, then how can you help preserve business continuity in your companies? Well, one of the ways that you can do it is with the new GTLD. If a third-party registry goes down, or if your .com gets lost, don't think that it won't. Google probably didn't think last April that Google.com.ar in Argentina was going to be awarded to a Buenos Aires web developer who paid, I think, 270 pesos for it. Shouldn't have done, shouldn't have been made available. They claim the renewal had been paid, but somehow he was able to buy it. So don't sit back and think that .com is impregnable, because it's not. So with a .brand, what you can do if your .com goes down, you can use social media and you can drive your clients to your .brand, which is under your control. It can be in your networks, and you make available a subset of information and communication there. So, you know, there is a very good hidden use for .brand registries, and we've got clients who are making much more use, really tangible use in the background with their .brands than they will in a way that consumers will see. So don't judge .brands by the number of brands in the registries. Much better thing to do is look at the traffic that flows across a .brand domain name. A side benefit of a .brand is that on your .brand, which sits in your registry, you get fantastic metrics that any digital marketing person will die for. You can see what's being searched for. You can register it in a millisecond. And now we're seeing clients of ours like KPMG who've completed a complete migration to KPMG. So home.kpmg is what kpmg.com used to be. And in Japan, yesterday in a conversation, Lynn Sharp told me that they are no longer registering any third-party domains at any registry anywhere in the world. They will only be putting new domains in their .sharp registry. They're going to keep what they've got in third-party registries for defensive purposes, but .sharp is where the future is for them. So I'm advocating for you to seriously consider a .brand, which is not the same thing as saying you should do it, because it's not. Because for some of you, when you're making difficult choices, application fee probably going to be 100,000. Timing, application is probably going to open in 2023. We can jump forward to the next slide, which is about challenges. So some of the applicant challenges. I've spoken about timing. 2023 is when we expect it. The next line is wrong. I realised that when I read this earlier. It's not going to be an ever open application process. What it's going to be is a predictable application process. And this is a really important point. Round one kicked off in 2012, so 9 years ago. Round two probably start in 2023. But there will be, once round two is assessed, then it's Icann's intention to routinely open an application window, probably annually, for a couple of months. So this fear of missing out in round two is something you do have to think about. If you've got a key brand or mark which someone somewhere else in the world has also registered in a different class of goods and services, think about it very carefully, because you could be locked out of it. A challenge is what to apply for. In the first round, one or two brands ventured to apply for a generic term. So famously, Google put in an application for .search and then withdrew it at the suggestion of Icann, because it was felt to be a kind of monopolistic activity. Although, of course, it wasn't really in breach of competition laws until they started using it. But, you know, if you work in confectionery, would owning .chocolate be good for you? Would owning .chocolate with a consortium of other confectionery companies who all maintain high standards, could that be good for you? Or is it no good because you want your clients to come to your brand? So think about what to apply for. The most important message probably is the next one, about developing a plan for use that supports business need. So it might be you need a champion to assess the viability of application and to manage the application process. But maybe that champion, once you get it, needs to hand it over to digital marketing or someone else who can really use it. there is not much point in registering one of these if you don't intend to use it, although we are trying to develop a cheap as chips kind of defensive, I don't really want one, but I don't want anyone else to have it play, where we take out all the costs anyway. So last few points here. You need to prepare competition for the same string as someone else is there. You could, for the same string as you've applied for, within what's called a contention set. In the first round, contention sets were resolved through private settlement or an auction. It took Merck, I think, 9 years to get to the American Merck and the German Merck, 9 years to get that private settlement. I suggest you need to think about that. If you've got a competitor or there's someone else who uses the mark, think about it very carefully. Auction strategy, just be really careful. Private auctions were developed last year, and they were manipulated in a perfectly legal way, in that the company that was running private auctions would hold 5 or 6 on the same day. And there were a couple of companies who would be taking part in all 5 or 6 auctions. And I don't know how it happened, but what would happen is a company would lose the first auction, but the model of auction that was used meant that if you lost an auction, you received a share of the winning bid. So say there were 4 people bidding for it, then you would receive a third of the money. It would come back to you. So they'd lose the first one, but they'd build up their war chest. They'd lose the second one, they'd build up their war chest. So by the time it came to the last auction, they had a thumping great war chest from having lost the ones above them. Now, not so important for a dot brand, but it might be that you're looking at a generic term. And, you know, .web, it went for $140 million. .app went for, I think, for $25 million. So there is a value attached to these things. So that's a quick, obvious set of summary about the challenges. I'm going to stop there. What's the time? Yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you very much. I haven't seen any questions coming in, but I've been busy speaking probably too fast. I'll slow down now. If there's anything else you want to ask, then please do so.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Nick and Lorna. As expected, that was fantastic. And we do have a couple of questions pre-prepared, which are a couple of things that have come up over the last couple of months, actually, so it's good timing. So forgive me for reading off the screen, something I hate doing, but many of our clients seek to recover domain names that targets their brands illegitimately, and in most cases they have no ongoing commercial use for them. How would you recommend those clients avoid building a portfolio of toxic domain names they have no interest in using, but feel obliged to incur ongoing renewal costs? I think this might be one.
Okay, I think the first thing you should do in that scenario, if you, for example, you win an Udrp against one case and you get 49 other domains coming in from the owner that you didn't really want, and they're hopeless variations, horrible variations with hyphens and exclamation marks and stuff. If you're going to delete them, which is what I would recommend, first of all, remove the functionality from them, so there's no traffic, and then at the renewal time, don't renew them. If there's no traffic, you can also ask your watching service to keep an eye open for them and see if anyone kind of grabs them back. But be a little bit more confident about lapsing them. The alternative, though, which is really to the heart of this question, is how can you manage domain names cost effectively? The solution that we've developed is what we call cold storage. We've got several clients who stored us about 2,000 domain names, which are really low value to them. So what we do is it's like the cold storage servers that exist. We put them in cold storage. That means there's no functionality. We do very little reporting on them. They sit in the portal. They want to take them out of cold storage. We charge them something for taking it out and reactivating it. But otherwise, it sits in cold storage, and we just pay the renewal, and they appear at the bottom of the report, and that's it. And I think that's a good way of doing it. But I do believe that brands should be a little bit more confident about assessing the viability and the value of a domain name now. And just because someone had it once doesn't mean it'll be taken in the future. And even if it is taken, if the domain name it's got little value to you, and whoever takes it doesn't put up a website, then so what? It's in a registry and someone else is paying for it. Let them carry on paying for it. Because they'll probably drop it at renewal time.
Brilliant. Thank you. Question 2. A client is planning a high-profile launch of a new service and has secured its core domain name and applied the required security settings. They are considering registering several variations of the core domain name defensively. In this scenario, how much is too much?
It's a little bit like which names do you hang on to and which names do you let go. And I think that what's very helpful is that rather than deciding each time on a case-by-case basis, which means you're reinventing the wheel over and over again asking the same questions, I would say to a client, work with your trademark team or your trademark advisors to develop a footprint registration profile. And typically that's, of course, going to be countries where you trade, plus .com, plus perhaps TLDs that are very subject to infringement like Russia or China. And then when a new launch comes up, you've got the template ready and you say, yes, we'll register these. Oh, and we'll tweak it because we know we're also launching in Italy or whatever. Now, so far as typo variations are concerned, current good practice tends to say, don't do typo variations because really, where do you stop? And I think the only time that I would be inclined to do it is if you have a term that is really subject to misspellings, like the difference between MC and MAC, look and Mac. You might want justin.com to register a couple of variations there, but very, very limited. And Nick says, don't think that registration is always the answer. You can watch, see what else is being registered. And if you find that people really are piling in, you can perhaps rethink your strategy. But you don't have to register everything everywhere because you can't. And I also think that, going back to what you were saying, Nick, about round 2 coming up, this is a fantastic use of .brand. There was a French insurance agency, now Nick, correct me if I get this wrong, but in their .brand, I think they registered, was it every city in which they have an office?
MMA, yes.
And they
registered every region in France, every city in France, every town in France in which they have an insurance salesperson.
Right. And they would never have done that under .fr because it would have been ridiculously expensive. But they can do it for a few euros under their own TLD.
Euro cents.
A few euro cents under, exactly, under their own TLD, their own GTLD. And it means that they can use that to assess how much traffic they get, what is actually useful, what isn't useful. They can experiment in a way that they weren't able to do otherwise.
Brilliant. So it comes back to the toolkit idea again as well.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
Absolutely.
And finally, last question. Your recent white paper of the importance of domain name security, and I know we said earlier about we could do a whole session on security, probably touched upon this. You present how to develop a bespoke DNS security strategy. You also stated that 79% of the organizations that you surveyed had experienced a DNS attack throughout 2020. Can you summarize for our audience the key elements of your paper?
Yeah. Well, and Nick, if you're okay, I'll take this one. To help focus our clients' minds on the importance of domain name security, we ask them to quantify risk. So if their key domain went down for 5 minutes, an hour or a whole day, what would that mean to them in terms of loss of money or loss of reputation? And for almost all of our clients, without exception, it would be so disastrous that it warrants a separate formal risk mitigation plan to address this. You need to know what the risk would mean to you and then address it. And to address it, start by wrapping your critical domains in appropriate security protocols. So this means ensuring that multi-factor authentication is used wherever possible in the domain's life cycle. So when you access your registrar or when your registrar accesses the registry, make sure that everybody who can in the chain is using multi-factor. lock the domain at the registrar level, lock it at the registry level, and agree with your registrar very specific protocols for how to handle these critical names. So typically that could be something like, we have to have a two-person sign-off from your end. And that's another really good reason for using a corporate registrar, because a retail registrar is not set up to do that, and a corporate registrar should be able to tailor a plan specifically for you. So once you've wrapped up the domain name itself, you need to use appropriate enterprise-level DNS that guarantees 100% uptime and also traffic and load monitoring. So it doesn't just keep the domain always accessible, but it's accessible quickly. So it absolutely delivers a premium DNS experience. Now, we address all of these points with a client before they onboard with us, and we build them into our take-on. So we have very, very robust processes in place that involve checks, multiple sign-offs to completely eliminate risk. Names do not go down when you take them on.
Yeah.
And as a kind of a final corollary to that, and one of the things that I know our paper touches on, is don't forget your end users. You need to provide them with security as well. So SSL certificates for any time that you're going to be transferring data from your customer to your customer, you want to encrypt that data. And an SSL certificate will protect your customer and give them confidence that you are who you say you are.
Brilliant. I know the portfolio audits that we've done together, how frequently the registry locks are not in place. And it seems a pretty simple, basic solution to really quite a big risk. So that's definitely something that we'd
always recommend it for, certainly for .com. Very easy to apply, and it means that your domain cannot be transferred away or moved to another set of servers, and that really is very fundamental.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Well, that concludes today's session. Massive thank you to Nick and Lorna for coming to Chancery Lane today. I mean, actually being in an office feels a bit of a novelty, which is I hope it comes across on the screen that we're about a metre apart, trying to be responsible. Just wanted to add a quick reminder, as you can see on your screen, upcoming IP360 webinars on the 12th of October. Got a fantastic team following on this digital theme, really, with Nick, Hannah and Neil discussing strategic approaches to online enforcement. And on the 26th, our ever popular session on brand clearance with Brinsley, Dominic, Steve and Sinead. And that is pretty much it. And it just is my final piece to say thank you for joining us. And thank you to Lorna and Nick again. And if you've got any questions, by all means, come back to us, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Have a great evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex.
Bye-bye.